Hello, everyone. This is Tom Fox, back again with Magnum PI for another episode of Compliance Into the Weeds. Yes, Matt Kelly is with us today, incognito. Matt, great shirt and welcome back.
Thank you, Tom. People should know it is 92 degrees in Boston, where I am currently recording. So why not record wearing my Hawaiian shirt? Tom, I actually have a series of about 3 or 4 different Hawaiian shirts that I wear over the summer. If we ever have a big compliance conference in the summertime, I will be happy to wear the shirts live and in person. But yes, I'm doing my best Magnum PI impersonation. We can now pause for all of the younger compliance officers who are wondering who's Magnum PI. But it was showing.
Well, we will inform them that Tom Selleck has already made a request for an appearance based on the shirt alone. So with that, Matt, it might not what?
They might not know who that is either.
Matt, you wrote about a couple of false claims acts last week. They went in a little bit different directions, but I think between the two of them, you were able to garner a fair number of lessons learned for compliance professionals. You want to unpack both of them for us?
Sure. So this was quite a striking juxtaposition of enforcement from the Civil Division of the Justice Department, where on the very same day, July 31st, they announced 2 settled false claims enforcement actions that, if you take them together, I think demonstrate some very stark differences in how FCA cases can unfold and what lessons compliance officers can learn. Although the hook that makes this really interesting is that while the 2 cases unfolded in a very different way, they were both about cybersecurity, where the companies in question were saying our security posture is X, and actually it was X minus 100 because they weren't delivering the cybersecurity they had promised in the federal contracts. And that can count as a violation of the False Claims Act. And we can pull out some really interesting contours about how you would make a mistake around this. What were the mistakes they actually made? And especially, what would the remedies be that the Justice Department now seems to be expecting for effective cybersecurity if you're a government contractor and you want to avoid False Claims Act enforcement? Let me take the bigger case first. So this was against Illumina. Now, they are a maker of DNA testing equipment and genomics sequencers. They're based out in California. They do a lot of business with the federal government, selling the DNA equipment to the Department of Health and Human Services, Veterans Affairs, Defense Department, I think, and a couple of others. But they were selling their equipment, and the period in question here for Illumina was in the 2010s. I think it was 2016 through 2023. So actually somewhat recent. But they had basically been selling these genomic sequencers with a lot of cybersecurity flaws allowed to exist within the design. So a whistleblower there took their complaints, filed a qui tam lawsuit under the False Claims Act on behalf of the federal government, which whistleblowers are entitled to do. This was a former project manager at Illumina, and she filed her whistleblower complaint. It was probably not entirely news because there have been other complaints from Illumina users, a lot of them, for example, in higher education, where these are biomedical researchers at universities trying to use their genomic sequencers. And, for example, one item cited in the complaint was the equipment fell victim to a ransomware attack, so the professor couldn't do his testing, stuff like that. And then fairly quickly, the Justice Department joined the whistleblower case. Illumina settled. We should note first that Illumina is within the world of DNA sequencing. Illumina is one of the biggest and most important companies in the world. It is currently on pace to sell about $4.2 billion in revenue, to give you a sense of how large the company is. But they neither confirmed nor denied the allegations in the complaint. They settled merely to avoid prolonged litigation. Whatever you need to tell yourself, Illumina, that's fine. And they agreed to pay $9.8 million in penalties and restitution. But Tom, here's what jumped out at me. The language in the settlement document that really grabbed me. The United States contends that the claims were false because Illumina knowingly failed to incorporate product cybersecurity in its software design, development, installation, and on-market monitoring. So you monitor the product after it's out in use, which is a standard requirement for any FDA-regulated product, which a DNA sequencer is. Fail to properly support and resource personnel, systems, and processes tasked with product security. Failed to adequately correct design features that introduced cybersecurity vulnerabilities in the sequencing systems, and falsely represented that the sequencing systems adhered to cyber standards, including ISO standards and NIST and whatnot. But Tom, what really jumped out to me more was the first parts of that gut paragraph there, where they said that Illumina hadn't embraced strong cybersecurity in product design, hadn't built up a capacity to monitor cybersecurity risk of its products over time. We can get into some of the whistleblower details too, if we'd like, which certainly support those broad allegations from the government. But think through what that would mean if you are a purveyor of cybersecurity related equipment to the federal government, where cyber is a risk you'd have to worry about. It's really getting to how are you going to bake cybersecurity into the design of your product. That's something I think government contractors are going to have to think about more often. It is more clearly a violation if you're FDA regulated, but everybody everywhere is starting to get annoyed with the sloppy cybersecurity in the technology supply chain generally. And so a lot of companies that are big buyers of tech are already saying to their vendors, enough security by design, build it into your product. I don't want to buy faulty products anymore. And now the ultimate buyer of technology, Uncle Sam, is also saying pretty much the same thing. And if you don't take this seriously, there's a False Claims Act risk in your future.
Man, I guess the thing that intrigued me in both your remarks and your blog post was this baking in of an appropriate level of cybersecurity into the product. And certainly we've seen cybersecurity washing, for lack of a better term, in prior administration SEC discussions. And I think we've seen some cases where companies didn't live up to their cybersecurity. But here, it really started at the beginning. And you can see where if you're going to sell to the federal government and you're going to certify yourself as cybersecurity or cyber secure, and you don't, that's going to lead to a False Claims Act. And it strikes me it's a level of, I'm not sure if intrusion is the right word, but we're drilling down to a level I'm not sure we've seen before.
I don't think we have seen it in cybersecurity before. We have seen False Claims Act enforcement against various government contractors for cybersecurity failures. But this one against Illumina is somewhat different. And I'll get back to the second case in a few minutes, which is more the traditional sort of False Claims Act enforcement. But traditionally, we would see that a vendor would say, I promise I adhere to NIST cybersecurity standards, different standards for different types of contractors. I am certifying that I am compliant with NIST. It turns out you're not, and there's an enforcement action. And for a lot of defense contractors or purveyors of government of technology equipment, yes, clearly that's going to be material to what they're actually buying. So there's a False Claims Act nexus that's pretty strong there. Illumina is somewhat different because this is the first one we've seen against a medical device maker, which also is technology, that's for sure. But because they're medical devices and they're regulated by the FDA, the Justice Department does have a stronger, clearer ability to enforce over security by design, because FDA rules do say you need to take all of this stuff really seriously from the very start. And then because, according to Uncle Sam and the whistleblower, because they say Illumina was not doing that, not only was it an FDA violation, but it was also a False Claims Act violation. And now we have this test case here that has resulted in an enforcement action. But let me tie it back to another one. There might be people out there who say, okay, that's cool, but I'm not a government contractor. I don't have to worry about this. What really intrigued me, the security by design issue with the Illumina case, is this is really the same sort of complaint that we saw earlier this year in the private sector. So back in April, at the start of the RSA Security Conference, which is the largest cybersecurity conference in the world, 45,000 people hanging out in San Francisco. I've been there myself once or twice over the years, big party. But on that first day, the CISO of JP Morgan, whose name is Patrick Optet, he basically shotgunned this open letter to the cybersecurity community saying, my bank, JP Morgan, buys 2 tons of technology. Everybody knows that. And we have had it with faulty cybersecurity. And he said the whole industry has to do better. The whole industry should embrace security by design, where it is more important to build a strong, secure product than to get the product out to market quickly. And you implicitly pass along the cybersecurity risk to everybody else. And when Patrick Optet released that open letter back in April, it caught a lot of attention. However, he is quite right. I think the common theme here is what would audit, cybersecurity, and compliance people need to insist upon at their companies to get security by design taken seriously. Some of it's pretty niche and nerdy, even for you and me, Tom. It's various approaches to product design in cybersecurity that we don't need to get into. But a lot of it is just about, are we building up the right capacity to be able to have secure equipment? Because if we don't, our customers might be mad. Uncle Sam might be mad. If we're a government contractor, there might be enforcement actions against us. So internal audit could certainly have a lot to do here around trying to build up strong security by design. What would that look like? And we could talk about that on another day. But internal audit could run an audit, basically, are we doing this or are we not? If you are not doing that, then you can expect FDA compliance examiners to give your company a really tough time if you are in any way FDA regulated. A lot of businesses are, but it's just points to the general sense that all of us have to do better at cybersecurity. We are all somebody else's vendor. We are all somebody else's third party. We are all part of the supply chain. And right now, security in the technology supply chain sucks. And more voices are saying this cannot endure. Patrick Optet said it in the private sector. Now we have the Justice Department saying it in a government contracting context. But there is no way that this is going to be the last such enforcement action we see, either from Justice or from some state regulator somewhere, or maybe more guidance from some other regulator about how to embed cybersecurity more seriously into your operations if you're building stuff that is consumed by other parties, which is everybody. So it was a striking enforcement action, I thought.
Matt, why can't either these vendors go ahead and not self-certify, but get certified under SOC 2 or NIST, or the purchaser, i.e. the federal government, put that in as a requirement? Isn't that a basic certification at this point?
Yes and no. You could request a SOC 1 or SOC 2 audit, and that might catch some of it, although SOC 2 audits, I would humbly say, are more geared for data privacy than they are cybersecurity. Some people out there will tell me I'm wrong. Okay, you can email me and tell me that, but I don't think so. SOC 2 audits are also tailored to specific engagements. It's not like in financial audit, which is done according to accounting principles. There's no such thing as generally accepted cybersecurity practices, that you could have a standard audit against those. And Tom, you'll be surprised to hear, and this leads us maybe into our second enforcement action. Sometimes companies certify that they are compliant with NIST cybersecurity standards, and they are wrong. Who would have thought? However, that brings us to the other FCA enforcement action on cybersecurity that came out just a few hours after the Illumina one, was an enforcement action against a California company called Aero Turbine. So Aero Turbine is a contractor to the U.S. Air Force, and they do engine repair and maintenance services for jet fighter engines and equipment like that. They wound up paying $1.75 million for allegations that they had certified they were compliant with the NIST standard, which was the actual standard is known as NIST 800-171, that governs how you would handle controlled, confidential, but unclassified information. So that's personal data or maybe contract details. It's known as CUI and it's pronounced QE. But a lot of government contractors will wind up handling QE. And you are supposed to certify that you have implemented all the cybersecurity controls of NIST 800-171, which is fairly long and complicated, and you have to get an audit and all of this stuff. Aero Turbine, basically, they had believed that they were compliant with 800-171, and they certified as such. However, they were wrong because they were confused about how they could or couldn't certify with different controls. What actually happened, let me dig up again the gut paragraph from the settlement order, was that Aero Turbine had assumed its implementation of export controls to protect technical data was sufficient to meet its cybersecurity obligations under the contract. But neither Aero Turbine nor Gallant Capital Partners, its private equity owner, they were both caught up in this, neither Aero Turbine nor its owner Gallant had verified whether Aero Turbine met the specific cybersecurity controls in NIST 800-171. Long story short, they thought that one set of technical controls they already had in place was going to qualify and count for the cybersecurity controls they were supposed to have in place, and they were wrong. That's that. They could have perhaps done an audit. I don't know. Maybe they did, and they had a bad audit, and it was led to a wrong conclusion. I'm not clear on how this misunderstanding came to pass, but it does remind me a lot about when we see enforcement actions, and inevitably the settlement document talks about how companies did not have sufficiently skilled or expert compliance personnel. This is what that means. This is an example of that. They went through what they thought their controls were and what their controls could do, and they reached the mistaken conclusion that the implementation of export controls would help them with their cybersecurity controls, and that was wrong. So as we think more and more about the immense difficulty of a lot of these compliance obligations that even today, under Trump 2.0, they're still around, export controls, sanctions controls. The Treasury Department has been crystal clear many times that its sanctions controls are a big, difficult thing, and you have to tread carefully. This is what that means. Export controls, same thing. Cybersecurity controls, same thing. You might need tools that help you map out what your obligations actually are, what controls you have. Do they really map to the obligations you have or not? I get it that in the perfect world, you want one or two controls that would map to many different obligations. That's wonderful. A few controls that killed many birds with one or two stones. This all went wrong here, and they did not kill birds with one stone. It looks like they dropped the stone on their foot, and they wound up having to pay $1.75 million. My sense is that this was a smaller offense than what Illumina was doing. I think that's part of why Illumina's fine was larger. They did self-report. They did cooperate. They did everything right. Aero Turbine did. Illumina did not know this was coming until a whistleblower dimed them out with a whistleblower lawsuit. Again, self-disclosure, clearly important. But both of these together, they just show how cybersecurity is becoming a bigger and bigger concern for False Claims Act jurisdiction. And a lot of companies will fall under that law.
Matt, could this be the situation where a company recognizes or believes that the compliance function, whatever that entails, can just cover everything that's legally related, complying with a federal law, and just assume that one size fits all? Or do you think it's maybe something different here?
The bottom line is we don't know. We do not have enough details and facts in these settlement orders to make good judgments. I will instead talk more generally that I think a lot of companies still struggle with having the capability to understand which controls can handle which regulatory obligations. It is true that you do not want duplicative controls over and over again, and it is very possible if you get carried away that you could wind up with a lot of duplicative controls for SOX compliance on accounting, for data privacy, for cybersecurity, for government contracting, for export controls, because you're sending cool stuff around the world to countries who we don't want them to get the stuff. So you could wind up with a lot of different controls that are probably redundant, and maybe you could redesign some of it to simplify your controls. SOX teams and internal audit teams do this on the financial reporting side all the time. We need that same capability for other regulatory compliance obligations. And do you have the right sort of integrated risk management tool? Do you have the right control mapping capabilities? Can your tool handle the proper frameworks, whether that is a NIST standard, an export control standard? You might have multiple NIST standards, and a lot of those NIST standards, the controls do map to each other. And if you have the right tool, what I'm talking about is not that hard to do. Technically, the technology is there, but I do wonder if, because we are getting so more wrapped up in the importance of cybersecurity and privacy and export controls and economic sanctions, a lot of smaller companies are going to wind up hitting these concerns, and they will not have the same capabilities that a large one that is publicly traded and been doing SOX for 2 decades, that does global business and is worried about FCPA for 2 decades and might even still be worried about FCPA today. Like, they have the chops to be able to do this. A lot of smaller companies might not have all the chops they need. And that's the thing that worries me when the enforcement risk and the liability here seems to be going up.
Matt, there's another point I'd like to explore with you, and I believe you told us that Illumina is a multi-billion-dollar company. I hope I got that.
Yes.
But Aero Manufacturing is valued much less, and I just looked it up while you were talking. It was sold in 2024 for $130 million.
Yeah.
So it's at least under $500 million at this point. And it strikes me, to pick up on your last point, that there are a lot of companies that, not that 130 million is not a lot of money, but are frankly not that large. And they don't have either the internal resources, skills, or external resources to put these in place. And when you're fining and penalizing companies in the 100 million range, that strikes me as a very different exercise than an Illumina.
I think that's right. But this is really where Uncle Sam in the Trump administration, they've said they're going to step up False Claims Act enforcement. They have said that they're going to treat export controls quite seriously. I think they also are treating cybersecurity quite seriously. There's all sorts of ways that the Trump administration now wants to use the False Claims Act. I think I previously said it was now the Swiss Army knife of enforcement that the government wants to hold against the throats of every government contractor it can find. And I think that's true. And sometimes that might be deserved. It really is more about how can you, small to mid-sized company, anticipate these compliance risks and build an effective compliance capacity when you probably don't have a lot of resources. There are technologies out there. There's any number of vendors who would be happy to tell you about why their technology is perfect. Some of them might even be telling the truth. You can go down that road. These risks they're real, and we are hitting compliance risks earlier in the corporate life cycle than we would have 20 or 30 years ago. Largely because cybersecurity even a very small company can introduce really big cybersecurity liabilities for a lot of people and make everybody very angry. So you are going to have to think about that. And if you're a small company worried about it, you've got a lot to worry about. There are ways to think it through, but it is not a risk that you can ignore.
Matt, Tom Selleck has phoned in and he's ready to have a guest appearance. So hopefully we can do that down the road. And I can't wait to see what next week brings us.
Thank you, Tom.
Compliance Podcast Network. Start your mornings with daily compliance news, quick, sharp updates on the top compliance and ethics stories in under 5 minutes every morning in Compliance Podcast Network. Because compliance never sleeps. Need practical advice fast? Check out Compliance Tip of the Day. One actionable idea to level up your program. Short and sweet, every day on Compliance Podcast Network. Got 10 minutes? We've got the week's top 10 stories. 10 for 10 brings you the big compliance headlines. Fast, fun, and focused. Every Saturday on Compliance Podcast Network. And don't miss the Sunday book review. where compliance meets culture through must-read books and big ideas every Sunday in Compliance Podcast Network. Whether you're in the office, on a walk, or commuting, stay smart, stay ethical, stay tuned. Only on the Compliance Podcast Network, available wherever you listen to podcasts.